Before dawn on the 23rd of February 1942, the air above the Sittang River is thick with the sound of Japanese machine gun fire. Tracers sweep the full length of the railway bridge, a black steel monster stretching 1,650 feet across the dark water. On the western bank, a young sapper officer crouches behind a sandbag emplacement, his hand resting on the plunger of an explosive detonator. The bridge is wired to blow, but two entire brigades are still fighting on the far side. A blinding flash rips through the half-darkness. The air turns hot with the rush of exploding cordite. Span number 5 drops away and plunges into the river. Fragments of hot steel whistle past the crouching men. When the echo dies, an immense silence settles over the water. Then, from the far bank, the sound of Japanese voices rises in sudden excitement. The British troops, still east of the river, stare at the broken steelwork and realize they are stranded. How did a British division come to destroy its own bridge of retreat, abandoning thousands of its own soldiers on an enemy shore? The road to that desperate explosion began weeks earlier, with an army that was supposed to hold a frontier but was already beginning to crumble. The war in Burma erupted in January 1942, when the Japanese 15th Army stormed across the Thai border into Tenasserim. Their aim was not merely to seize territory, but to cut the Burma Road, the lifeline that fed supplies into nationalist China. Facing them was the 17th Indian Division, under the command of Major General John Smith, a decorated veteran of the First World War who had never before set foot in Burma. Smith flew into the port of Moulmein and was appalled by what he found. The town perched on a ridge above a mile-wide river estuary, its back to the water and its flanks exposed to jungle-covered hills. He saw no barbed wire, no sandbags, and a perimeter 25 miles long, held by barely 3 battalions. He told his army commander, Lieutenant General Tom Hutton, that the position was untenable and asked permission to withdraw. Hutton refused. Pressure was building from above. The Supreme Commander, General Archibald Wavell, had signaled that he could not understand why Moulmein could not be held. Hutton ordered the town defended as long as possible. Smith had no authority to retreat on his own initiative, so he dug in and waited for the blow to fall. The blow landed on the 30th of January. Japanese troops of the 55th Division attacked from the south and east, then infiltrated through gaps in the perimeter using parties disguised as Burmese civilians. Some battalions of the Burma Rifles, poorly trained and already shaken, began to desert. By early afternoon, the Japanese were closing in on the riverfront jetties, the only escape route across the Salween. The acting garrison commander, Brigadier Roger Eakin, telephoned Smith and asked for permission to pull out. Smith gave it. Indian sappers and miners took over the ferryboats whose civilian crews had fled. Under shellfire and machine gun bursts, the garrison was ferried across the mile-and-a-half-wide river. 2 mountain guns were saved by a battery commander who doubled back through the Japanese lines to retrieve a lost section. When the last launch pushed off, the Japanese were already on the jetty. Moulmein was in their hands. Smith would later call its defense a grave tactical error, fought at the end of a nightmare supply line with a wide river at his back. But the loss of the town opened the road north. The Japanese now had their springboard toward Rangoon. Through the first weeks of February, the 17th Division fell back up the narrow coastal corridor toward the Sittang River. The troops were exhausted, thirsty, and increasingly aware that they had no air cover. Everything in the sky was Japanese. By the 21st, the division was strung out along the road to Mokpalin, just east of the Great Railway Bridge. The sappers responsible for demolition were already struggling with inadequate equipment. Lieutenant Roy Hudson of the Malakotla Field Company was told to prepare the bridge with whatever explosives he could scrounge. 1 span was wired for electric detonation. The other 2 would require fusee matches and lengths of safety fuse, an operation impossible to carry out under aimed rifle fire. In the early hours of the 23rd, the situation exploded. Brigadier Noel Hugh Jones, commanding the bridgehead, assembled his officers near the smoking sandbag emplacements. He asked the sapper commander, Major Richard Orgill, if he could guarantee destroying the bridge during daylight. Orgill said he could not. The fusing was too fragile. Any casualties among the lighting parties would leave the demolition incomplete. Hugh Jones knew what had to be done. He telephoned John Smith at his headquarters 8 miles to the west. 2/3 of the division was still east of the river. If the bridge was not blown, a complete Japanese division could march straight into Rangoon. Smith listened, then gave his answer in less than 5 minutes. Blow the bridge. The order reached Lieutenant Bashir Ahmed Khan, crouched in a foxhole on the western abutment. He had linked the circuits of spans 4, 5, and 6 together to ensure a powerful detonation. Just after 4 in the morning, the last Gurkha rearguard scrambled clear of the bridge. Khan pressed the plunger. The electrical charge fired, but only span 5 fully collapsed into the river, its twisted girders still visible above the surface. The explosion sent shock waves through the men on the far bank. Rage and despair overwhelmed them as they understood they had been abandoned. Some Indian units surrendered on the spot. Others waded into the treacherous current, clutching their rifles, trying to swim across. Hundreds drowned or were swept away. The 17th Division lost most of its heavy weapons and much of its cohesion. John Smythe would be relieved of his command and later stripped of his rank, taking full responsibility for a decision that was not really his alone. With the Sittang broken, Rangoon lay exposed. By the first week of March, the capital was a ghost city. Fires burned unchecked in the residential quarters. Looters and escaped convicts roamed the empty streets. The gleaming Shui Dagon pagoda rose above the drifting black smoke as the last British troops prepared to leave. A new army commander had arrived from the Middle East. General Harold Alexander touched down on the 5th of March and within 24 hours realized the city could not be saved. Demolition parties blew the docks, the power station, and the oil refineries at Syriam. On the 7th, the garrison began its withdrawal north, heading for the junction where the Pegu Road met the route to Prome. But just beyond Taukian, a Japanese roadblock had been thrown across the highway. The entire convoy, including Alexander and his headquarters staff, ground to a halt. Through the night, battalions of Gurkhas and Sikh infantry threw themselves at the block. Tanks of the 7th Hussars charged up the road, but Japanese anti-tank fire stopped them cold. Alexander spent the night in a rubber plantation, ringed by armor and surrounded by his own headquarters clerks and orderlies. A dawn attack was planned, with artillery bombardment and a coordinated infantry assault. It went in and failed, yet by mid-afternoon, the Japanese were simply gone. The block was empty. Alexander drove through, genuinely baffled. Only later did the explanation emerge. Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai, commanding the Japanese 33rd Division, had ordered his regiment to disengage and push on to Rangoon, fearing any delay would allow the British to fortify the city. The pursuit of Alexander's army was sacrificed for the prize of the capital. On the 8th of March, Japanese soldiers marched into abandoned Rangoon. The port that had kept China supplied for half a decade was now in enemy hands, and the door to Upper Burma swung wide open. The remnants of the British and Indian forces were now gathered into a single formation, Burkorps. Its new commander was Lieutenant General William Slim, a stocky, plain-spoken officer of the Indian Army who had joined the fight in the middle of the rout. He faced an appalling task to extricate his shattered divisions up the Irrawaddy Valley and across the Chindwin River before the monsoon broke. The retreat became a 900-mile ordeal. Japanese columns pushed up the rivers in landing craft, cutting routes and ambushing rearguards. On the 10th of May, Slim himself was caught on the jetty at Shwegyin as mortar bombs began falling among the packed steamer loads of men. The last tanks, jeeps, and guns were destroyed on the east bank. Soldiers who had marched for weeks through burning heat and torrential downpours now trudged into the jungle hills leading toward the Indian frontier. Further north, the American General Joseph Stilwell had been trying to hold the Chinese front together. When that collapsed, he gathered his staff, a party of Chinese soldiers, and a medical team under an American missionary doctor. They abandoned their vehicles and walked. On the 20th of May, Stilwell crossed the border into India at Imphal and faced the press. He issued a brief, blunt summary. "We got a hell of a beating. It was as humiliating as hell. We ought to find out why it happened and go back." That same month, the survivors of Burkorps straggled into Imphal, gaunt as scarecrows, riddled with malaria and dysentery. Slim stood by the roadside and watched the rearguard march in. They were ragged, starving, their boots rotting from the monsoon mud, but they still carried their rifles and kept their ranks. They looked like soldiers. Behind them, the jungle tracks were littered with the bodies of tens of thousands of civilian refugees who had not survived the exodus. Over 500,000 Indians reached safety, but the cost in lives and shattered confidence would shadow everything that came next. The longest war had barely begun. The survivors of the long retreat lay in the mud and rain of Imphal, ravaged by malaria and blackwater fever. Their uniforms hung in tatters. Their ranks had been decimated. Yet even in this moment of utter exhaustion, a critical question faced the High Command. Could this army ever fight the Japanese again? By the autumn of 1942, General William Slim, now commanding the 15th Corps, wrestled with that question every waking hour. He had watched the rearguard march into India still carrying their weapons. He had seen the flash of defiance in hollow eyes, but he also saw the terror stories spreading through the ranks. The Japanese soldier was a jungle demon who could not be beaten. Slim understood that the disease was psychological as much as physical. Troops who had retreated nearly 1,000 miles believed they were fighting supermen. He told his officers bluntly that the Japanese were not supermen. They were faster in the jungle because they had trained for it. The British and Indian soldier could be trained too. The test of that conviction came on the Arakan coast in the dying days of 1942. From his headquarters in Ranchi, General Irwin of Eastern Army ordered the 14th Indian Division under General Lloyd to advance south toward the port of Akiab. The objective was to seize its vital airfields and strike a blow back into occupied Burma. Lloyd's men pushed down the Mayu Peninsula, a narrow strip of mangrove swamp and jungle ridge flanked by the Bay of Bengal. Opposition was light at first. The Japanese garrison under Colonel Miyawaki pulled back from Maundor and Buthidong, yielding the tunnel road through the Mayu Hills. British patrols reached Foul Point unopposed. Then the advance hit the forward defense line at Dombek. Here, a single company of Japanese infantry had dug into log and earth bunkers along a tidal chong. The bunkers had roofs 5 feet thick, impervious to shell fire. They were sited for interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Lloyd's men had never seen anything like them. Attack after attack shattered against Dombek through January and February. The Inniskillings charged. The Punjabis charged. A half-squadron of Valentine tanks from the Royal Armoured Corps ground forward through the sand and bogged in ditches they had not been told about. By March, the Arakan offensive had stalled completely, with mounting casualties and no ground gained. General Koga's 55th Japanese Division now counterattacked across the Mayu Range. His troops moved silently through jungle the British had declared impassable. They fell on the flank of the exposed coastal forces at Indin, overwhelming 6th Brigade headquarters. Brigadier Cavendish was captured and died moments later under a barrage of British counter-battery fire that crashed down on the village. The entire British position unravelled. 47th Brigade scattered into the hills, abandoning its heavy weapons. By May of 1943, the British were back on their start line, having lost 5,000 men for nothing. The intelligence officers who interrogated returning troops found a simple, devastating truth. The average soldier believed the Japanese were worth twice his own number in the jungle. But far to the north, in the dense teak forests west of the Chindwin River, a very different kind of operation was taking shape. Major General Ord Wingate was a gaunt, intense gunner officer with piercing blue eyes and a prophet's conviction. He had pioneered guerrilla warfare in Palestine and Abyssinia. He believed he could take the war deep behind Japanese lines. Wingate's idea was audacious. A brigade-sized force of 3,000 men, supplied entirely by air, would march hundreds of miles into enemy territory to blow up railways, ambush convoys, and prove that the Japanese rear was vulnerable. He trained his men with a ferocity that bordered on cruelty. Sick parades were abolished. Men learned to march 30 miles a day on half rations. Wingate himself ate raw onions and lectured endlessly on the virtues of the compass and the mule. On the night of 13th February 1943, the columns of 77th Indian Infantry Brigade began to cross the Chindwin River at Tonhe. Major Michael Calvert led No. 3 Column, a tough, irrepressible sapper who had strangled a Japanese officer during the retreat and had a reputation for recklessness. Major Bernard Ferguson of the Black Watch led Column 5, a monocled Etonian with a patrician drawl who had once been Wavell's aide. For the next 6 weeks, the Chindits moved invisibly through the Zibu and Mangin ranges, emerging to strike the Mandalay-Myitkyina railway. Calvert's men blew bridges at Nankan and tore up track in 70 places. Ferguson destroyed a bridge at Bongyang and sent a gorge crashing down onto the line. The explosions echoed through valleys that had not heard the war for a year. The Japanese hunted them with 3 full divisions. Colonel Koba's 55th Regiment blocked the Irrawaddy crossings. The pursuit was relentless. Wingate ordered his columns to disperse and return to India in small groups. The retreat became an ordeal of starvation, drowning, and exhaustion. Ferguson lost 2/3 of his command. Calvert brought his column out by walking straight through Japanese patrols at night. On the 29th of April, Wingate swam the Chindwin with his headquarters group, exhausted and half-starved. Of the 3,000 men who had crossed into Burma, just over 2,000 returned. But when Wingate walked into Imphal and declared the operation a success, something cracked open in the psyche of the Indian Army. Ordinary men from Liverpool and Glasgow had marched 1,000 miles behind enemy lines. They had proven the Japanese rear was not inviolable. In Delhi, the press clamoured for Wingate. Churchill demanded his promotion, and in his headquarters in Burma, General Mutaguchi began to plan the invasion that would finally break the British for good. The monsoon of 1943 washed over the Arakan Hills with a ferocity that made movement impossible. Roads dissolved into mud, rivers swallowed their banks. Both armies collapsed into a soggy stalemate, waiting for the rains to end and the killing season to begin again. In his forward headquarters in Manipur, General Slim was not waiting. He was rebuilding from the bones of disaster. The Arakan offensive had confirmed every fear he nursed since watching the rearguard stumble into Imphal a year earlier. The British and Indian soldier believed he could not beat the Japanese in the jungle. That belief had to be broken, not with speeches, but with a new kind of battle. Slim issued a simple, radical doctrine: when the Japanese cut your supply road, you do not retreat. You form a defensive box, you dig in, and you let the aircraft feed you. He called it the admin box concept. Every unit commander in the 14th Army was drilled in it through the monsoon months. Supply drops were rehearsed. Perimeter defense was rehearsed. The old terror of the severed line of communication was systematically dismantled. Meanwhile, far to the southeast, a Japanese general was planning something far more ambitious than a river crossing. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi had watched Wingate's Chindits vanish into his rear areas and emerge months later, emaciated but alive. The British were learning. Mutaguchi decided to teach them a final lesson before they grew too strong. The Japanese plan was audacious even by the standards of an army addicted to gambles. In the dry months ahead, Mutaguchi would launch a 2-pronged offensive. One arm would strike into Arakan again, aiming to draw Slim's reserves away from the central front. The other, far larger arm would hurl 3 divisions across the Chindwin and into the Imphal plain. The objectives were nothing less than the destruction of the British 14th Army and the invasion of India. Hago was the name given to the Arakan thrust, a preliminary operation designed to set the trap. In January 1944, the Japanese 55th Division began its march toward the Mayu Peninsula. These were the same men who had shattered Lloyd's offensive a year earlier. They expected to do it again. The Japanese moved fast, too fast for the forward British screen. Columns of infantry slipped through the jungle corridors they had mapped the previous year, bypassing strongpoints and heading straight for the soft administrative rear. By the first week of February, Sakurai's regiments had cut the road behind the forward divisions. The British units, following Slim's new doctrine, did not panic. They pulled back into concentrated perimeters and waited for air supply. But one location was not a perimeter of infantry. It was a sprawling, undefended depot known as the admin box at Sinswaya. It held ammunition dumps, field hospitals, supply depots, and the administrative tail of an entire corps. If the Japanese seized it, the forward divisions would starve. Sakurai knew this. He struck straight for it. The news reached Slim's headquarters in the early hours of the 10th of February. Japanese units were converging on Sinswaya from 3 directions. The garrison there was a scratch force: clerks, cooks, medical orderlies, engineers, and a handful of infantry from the West Yorkshire Regiment. There were no prepared defences. There was no continuous perimeter. There was only ammunition, food, and the certainty that retreat would doom the forward brigades. Slim gave the order he had spent the monsoon preparing his army to obey. The admin box would hold. It would be supplied by air. It would become the anvil on which the Japanese hammer shattered. The 1st Dakota transport aircraft began dropping supplies that afternoon, circling low over the hills as Japanese machine gunners tried to track them. The siege of the admin box was a brutal, intimate fight fought at grenade range over supply stacks and field dressing stations. Japanese infiltrators crept through the perimeter at night, cutting throats and stealing into the hospital area. One night, a party of Japanese soldiers broke into the main dressing station and bayoneted wounded men lying on their stretchers. The defenders fought back with pistols, with entrenching tools, with their fists. The medical orderlies, men trained to save lives, picked up rifles and died holding a trench line they had dug with mess tins. The perimeter was never more than a mile across. At its center was the ammunition dump, a cluster of bamboo bashers stacked with artillery shells and mortar bombs. If it exploded, every man inside the box would die. The Japanese knew exactly where it was. Repeated assaults hammered the perimeter through the 3rd week of February. Sakurai's infantry charged the ammunition hill again and again, screaming their battle cries as British and Indian riflemen cut them down at the wire. The defenders held because they had food, because they had bullets, and because every night the Dakotas came. The aircraft dropped ammunition crates that sometimes fell directly into the Japanese lines. The defenders sent out parties to snatch them back under fire. The Japanese had no such lifeline. Their rations ran out within days. Their ammunition dwindled. They were expected to capture the food and bullets they needed from the enemy. When the British refused to abandon the box, the Japanese assault began to starve. The myth of the invincible jungle soldier was dying among the bamboo and the shell craters. The relief force from the 5th Indian Division had been fighting its way toward Sinswaya since the siege began. It moved through the same jungle corridors the Japanese had used, ambushing and counter-ambushing in a grinding battle of patrols. The tanks of the 26th Indian Tank Brigade pushed down narrow tracks between walls of bamboo, their guns crashing into Japanese bunkers at point-blank range. Progress was measured in yards and in lives. On the 24th of February, the leading tanks broke through the last Japanese roadblock on the Engakyedauk Pass. The corridor was open. The column rolled into the admin box that afternoon, greeted by men who had not slept properly in 18 days, men whose uniforms were stiff with dried blood and mud. The siege was lifted. The cost of Sakurai's offensive lay scattered across the hills around Sinswaya. The 55th Japanese Division had suffered over 5,000 casualties, nearly half its combat strength. The wounded who could not walk were left behind with grenades to take their own lives. The survivors retreated in small, starving groups, hunted by British patrols and haunted by the knowledge that they had failed. For the first time in the Burma campaign, a Japanese division had attacked, and a British force had stood firm and broken it. The psychological impact rippled through both armies. The defenders of the admin box had proven that Japanese infiltration tactics could be defeated. All it required was courage, discipline, and the confidence that aircraft would come. Slim read the after-action reports with a quiet satisfaction that masked the full weight of what had been achieved. The admin box was not just a victory, it was the validation of an entire philosophy of war, a philosophy born in the mud of Imphal and tempered in the jungles of Arakan. He now knew that the 14th Army could fight and win. He also knew, with a colder certainty, that the admin box was only the beginning. Mutaguchi's Hago had been a diversion. The main blow was still coming, aimed not at a supply depot, but at the heart of India itself. The Japanese 15th Army was already massing on the Chindwin. The great invasion of Imphal was only weeks away. Slim had won the first round. He was preparing for the knockout. The dry season dust of March 1944 still hung over the Chindwin River when the full weight of Operation Yugo began to move. Mutaguchi launched 3 divisions across the water on the 15th, the largest Japanese offensive ever mounted against India. The 33rd Division thrust toward Tidim to cut off the 17th Indian Division from the rear. The 15th Division pushed through the jungle tracks towards Sangshak and the Imphal Plain, and the 31st Division under Lieutenant General Sato aimed its columns directly at the hill station of Kohima, a tiny administrative post whose road junction controlled the only supply artery feeding Imphal from the railhead at Dimapur. Sato's men crossed the Chindwin, carrying more supplies than any Japanese formation before them. They drove herds of cattle and elephants through the river shallows. They hauled dismantled mountain guns on bamboo poles up the mud-slick paths of the Naga Hills. The British had calculated the Japanese could not move a division through such terrain in less than 3 weeks. Sato's advance guard reached the outskirts of Kohima in just over 2. The speed was so unexpected that when the first Japanese patrols cut the Dimapur road on the 3rd of April, the garrison commander had fewer than 1,500 fighting men under his command. The scrapyard garrison thrown together at Kohima was a study in improvisation. Men from the Assam Rifles stood alongside odds and ends of the Royal West Kents. A handful of Burmese levies and Indian sappers manned slit trenches on the forward slope of Garrison Hill. The district commissioner's bungalow had been transformed into a strongpoint, its tennis court now a stretch of beaten red earth between opposing lines. From his forward command post near the Chindwin, Mutaguchi believed Kohima would fall within 48 hours, freeing the 31st Division to descend on Dimapur and sever 14th Army's jugular. The fury of the first assault on Kohima Ridge on the 4th of April confirmed every fear the defenders had harbored. Japanese infantry surged up the terraced hillsides in waves, their officers screaming orders through the din of mortar fire. The garrison fell back step by step through the burning bungalow and the smashed cookhouses of the field supply depot. By nightfall, the perimeter had contracted to a tight circle of knolls no more than 500 yards across. Wounded men lay in shallow scrapes, while medical orderlies operated by torchlight under direct machine gun fire from the ridges above. The Kohima tennis court became the epicenter of the siege, a white line scratched into the dirt between two trench systems. Japanese grenadiers crouched on one side of the court, British and Indian riflemen on the other. The distance between the two lines shrank to 20 yards. Men threw grenades over the netting posts and lunged with bayonets through the gaps in the wire. A young Assam Rifles havildar held his section of the trench for 3 days without relief, his ammunition replenished by comrades crawling across the exposed earth after dark. The Japanese, trained to believe that determined spirit could overcome any material obstacle, hurled themselves at the line again and again. Slim, coordinating the battle from his headquarters in Kamilla, understood that Kohima was the fulcrum on which the entire Imphal campaign would pivot. He diverted the British 2nd Division from Dimapur and ordered it to fight its way up the road to the beleaguered garrison. The relief column punched into the Japanese roadblocks on the 12th of April, its infantry advancing behind concentrated artillery barrages that stripped the jungle cover from the hillsides. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each mile of the twisting mountain road cost a dozen casualties as Japanese rearguards fought from bunkers blasted into the rock faces overlooking the track. The defenders on Kohima Ridge had by now endured 2 weeks of unbroken combat without adequate water, food, or sleep. The monsoon had not yet broken, and the hillsides were tinder dry. Every shot kicked up clouds of dust that clogged throats and jammed weapon mechanisms. Men drank from the radiators of destroyed trucks and licked moisture from the leaves of banana trees at the edge of the perimeter. The wounded lay where they fell because there was no safe ground to carry them to. The smell of decomposition drifted across the tennis court from bodies that could not be retrieved from the Japanese lines. On the 18th of April, the advance guard of the British 2nd Division fought its way into visual range of the Kohima garrison. Tanks of the 149th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps ground up the narrow road, their guns smashing Japanese bunkers at ranges so close that the muzzle flashes ignited the bamboo revetments. A troop of Stuart tanks reached the edge of the bazaar and began systematically destroying the Japanese positions that had pinned the garrison against Garrison Hill. The link-up between the relief force and the survivors on the ridge was a moment of raw, exhausted emotion that none of the men who experienced it would ever forget. Sato's troops, however, did not withdraw. They fell back to the commanding heights around Kohima village and continued to resist with a tenacity that surprised even the British commanders who had fought them for 2 years. The battle for the hills around Kohima would drag on for another 6 weeks, a grinding, hill-by-hill struggle that consumed battalions and reduced regiments to company strength. Sato's subordinates, facing starvation and the impossibility of resupply, began to refuse orders for suicidal frontal attacks. The commander of the 58th Infantry Regiment, a man who had led his troops from Singapore to the gates of India, formally protested against what he called a criminal waste of irreplaceable soldiers. The Japanese logistical system, on which Mutaguchi had staked his entire plan, had collapsed with breathtaking speed. The cattle herds driven across the Chindwin were slaughtered by British air attacks or died of exhaustion on the mountain tracks. The elephant transport companies lost their animals to malnutrition and disease. The ammunition dumps that Sato's quartermasters had established were destroyed by RAF fighter bombers that ranged unchallenged over the Naga Hills. By the middle of May, the Japanese 31st Division was fighting with less than a third of its establishment strength, its men subsisting on a handful of rice per day and foraging for edible roots in the jungle. The human cost of the siege of Kohima was catastrophic on both sides, but for the Japanese it represented the destruction of an entire division as a fighting force. Of the 15,000 men Sato had led across the Chindwin in March, barely 5,000 remained under arms by the time the monsoon rains began to lash the hills in late May. The rest lay dead on the slopes of Garrison Hill, died of wounds in abandoned dressing stations, or had simply vanished into the jungle, too weak from hunger and disease to continue fighting. The British counted over 4,000 Japanese bodies on Kohima Ridge alone, many of them lying within touching distance of the defensive perimeter they had failed to overrun. Meanwhile, on the Imphal plain, the two other prongs of Mutaguchi's offensive had met the same fate. The 33rd Division, which had cut off the 17th Indian Division at Tidim, found itself unable to close the trap. The British Division, following the admin box doctrine that had been drilled into every unit commander during the monsoon of 1943, formed a defensive perimeter and waited for resupply by air. Transport aircraft dropped ammunition and rations directly onto jungle clearings, while the infantry held the perimeter against repeated Japanese assaults. The Japanese, who had planned on seizing British supply dumps to feed their own troops, watched their rations dwindle to nothing, while the defenders grew stronger by the day. By the end of May, Mutaguchi's grand offensive lay in ruins. Over 50,000 Japanese soldiers had become casualties in the twin battles of Imphal and Kohima, the greatest defeat ever inflicted on the Imperial Japanese Army in a land campaign. The survivors were retreating in small, starving columns toward the Chindwin, hotly pursued by 14th Army spearheads. Mutaguchi himself sat in his forward command post near the river, his face grey with exhaustion and disbelief, dictating messages to Tokyo that blamed his subordinates for the failure. He would be relieved of command within weeks, his career destroyed by the catastrophe he had so confidently planned. After the war, he was tried and imprisoned for his role in the campaign. Slim, meanwhile, issued orders for the pursuit. The 14th Army, which had been written off as a defeated rabble 2 years earlier, was now advancing on every front. The psychological transformation was complete. The Japanese, who had seemed unbeatable in 1942, had been broken in open battle by troops who had learned to stand firm, to trust their supplies, and to fight on ground of their own choosing. From his headquarters in Camilla, Slim began planning the next phase of the campaign, a general offensive that would carry British and Indian divisions across the Chindwin and back into the heart of Burma. Far to the north, in the Hukong Valley, the American general Joseph Stilwell was pushing his Chinese-American force toward Myitkyina, the last Japanese stronghold in northern Burma. But his days as theater commander were numbered. Chiang Kai-shek, infuriated by Stilwell's blunt criticisms of Chinese leadership, had demanded his removal, but that lay in the future. For now, in the spring of 1944, the tide in Burma had turned decisively and forever against the armies of Imperial Japan. The monsoon of 1944 broke over the Kabul Valley with a violence that stunned even the most seasoned jungle veterans. Slim's forward headquarters in Camilla became the nerve center of a military metamorphosis, the place where the long retreat was finally reversed. Staff officers shuffled maps and marked ferry crossings, while the general himself sat with his corps commanders, sketching the outlines of a great wheeling offensive aimed at the Irrawaddy. The pursuit of Mutaguchi's shattered divisions had already begun, spearheads pressing through the mud toward the Chindwin crossings that would lead, at last, back into Burma. The tactical lessons of the admin box and Kohima were being forged into a new operational doctrine, even as the survivors of those battles marched south. Every battalion received intensive retraining in encirclement tactics, the men taught to stand fast when cut off and wait for the Dakotas that would bring them ammunition and food. The psychological transformation was complete. The Japanese soldier was no longer a jungle superman but a starving fugitive, his supply columns destroyed by air attack, his divisions reduced to companies, his forward posts littered with abandoned weapons and the bodies of men who had died of disease and hunger. Above the Hukawng Valley, in the rugged highlands where monsoon fog clung to the ridgelines, Stilwell's Chinese-American columns were battering against the last Japanese stronghold in northern Burma. The airfield at Myitkyina had been seized by a glider-borne assault in May, a triumph that had stiffened into a grinding siege. The town itself was a labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels, defended by a garrison that fought with the same desperate ferocity their comrades had shown at Kohima. The Chinese divisions, painstakingly retrained at Ramgarh, crawled forward yard by yard, their advance paid for in casualties that the Chinese high command watched with seething resentment. Stilwell himself lived with his forward troops, a gaunt and angular figure in a sweat-stained uniform who shared the privations of his soldiers and expected them to fight as he had fought. His contempt for Chiang Kai-shek's commanders, whom he regarded as corrupt and pusillanimous, had been broadcast in blunt and undiplomatic memoranda that reached Chungking with inflammatory regularity. The generalissimo, infuriated by these criticisms and alarmed by the casualties his divisions were absorbing, began to demand Stilwell's removal through every channel available to him. The long-simmering conflict between the two men was approaching its final rupture. Through the autumn months, as the monsoon gave way to the dry campaigning season, the strategic picture across the entire Burma theatre sharpened with encouraging clarity. In the north, Stilwell's forces were grinding toward Meet Kiina town, their supply lines now secure, but their progress still slow against determined defenders who contested every bunker and every street. On the central front, Slim's 14th Army was transforming itself from a defensive shield into an offensive sword, divisions moving into assembly areas, tank squadrons hauling their armor across newly built roads toward the Chindwin ferries. The long retreat of 1942 was about to be answered. On an October morning in the Hukang Valley, Joseph Stilwell stepped onto a transport aircraft and disappeared into the clouds. The breach with Chiang Kai-shek had finally snapped. Washington, unwilling to lose China over a general's blunt tongue, had summoned him home. He left behind his half-finished northern campaign, his Chinese divisions stalled before Meet Kiina, his war against Japanese bunkers and Chinese obstructionism unresolved. His departure closed an American chapter in the CBI theater. By mid-December, the operational preparations in Slim's headquarters had reached their final stage. The plan was audacious. Two corps would strike simultaneously across the Irrawaddy at widely separated points. 4th Corps under Frank Messervy in the north, near Singu and Nyangu, 33rd Corps under Stopford in the south, near Pakoku. The objective was nothing less than the disintegration of the Japanese defensive system across the entire sweep of central Burma, a system that had been erected over 2 years of occupation and that General Sakurai of 28th Army believed to be impregnable. The Irrawaddy lay across the British line of advance like a broad brown barrier, in places 3 miles wide, its far bank studded with bunkers and machine gun nests. Sakurai had disposed his regiments along the river's length, convinced that the British would attempt a crossing near Mandalay, where the approaches were most obvious and the terrain most favorable. Slim intended to do precisely the opposite. He would strike where the Japanese least expected him, crossing at points the enemy had dismissed as too difficult, then drive inland to cut the roads and railways that fed the Japanese army its ammunition and rice. The first phase of the offensive opened in the last days of December, a period of small probing actions and diversionary feints designed to fix Sakurai's attention on the Mandalay approaches. British and Indian patrols probed the riverbank at night, mapping currents and landing sites with the meticulous care of engineers preparing a dam. Behind the screen of these reconnaissance operations, the main assault formations were moving into their jump-off positions, tanks and lorries grinding south in long columns that raised dust clouds visible for miles, their passage masked by fighter patrols that kept Japanese reconnaissance aircraft at a safe distance. On the 14th of February, 4th Corps began its crossing near the ancient temple town of Nyaungu. The river here was broad and the current treacherous, but the element of surprise was almost total. Assault boats crammed with infantry pushed off into the mist at first light, the silence of the morning shattered by the sudden roar of artillery as the massed guns of the Corps opened fire on the far bank. Shells tore into Japanese bunkers and trench systems, the bombardment rolling ahead of the assault craft, while fighter bombers screamed down to plaster gun positions and command posts with rockets and cannon fire. Messervy's leading battalions scrambled up the muddy east bank under a hail of small arms fire from surviving Japanese positions. But the defense had been battered into confusion. Punjabi riflemen and Gurkha infantry fought their way inland, clearing bunkers with grenades and bayonets, pushing forward through bamboo thickets and paddy fields to establish a bridgehead a mile deep within the first 2 hours. Sappers began assembling the pontoon bridges that would carry the tanks and trucks across, working with frantic speed while bullets ripped through the air above them. By nightfall, the bridgehead was secure, and the armor was beginning to cross. To the south, 33rd Corps forced its passage near Pakoku against stiffer resistance, Japanese artillery pounding the crossing points and sinking assault craft with direct hits. The Durham Light Infantry and the Royal Scots marched straight into intense machine gun fire, their officers leading from the front, their medical orderlies dragging wounded back to the riverbank through ankle-deep mud. The price of the southern crossing was heavy, battalions losing a quarter of their strength in the first assault wave, but by nightfall on the 15th of February, the bridgehead was established and reinforcements were pouring across. Sakurai's Irrawaddy line was breached in 2 places. The collapse of the Irrawaddy defences triggered a crisis in the Japanese High Command that paralyzed their response. Sakurai had committed his reserves to blocking the Mandalay crossing that never came, and the forces facing Messavi and Stopford were hopelessly outnumbered. Japanese regiments scrambled to form blocking positions along the roads leading south toward Meiktila, the principal supply base of the entire Japanese army in central Burma. But the British armor was already moving, columns of Sherman tanks and lorried infantry rolling through the dusty plain at speeds that outpaced the Japanese infantry struggling south on foot. The capture of Mandalay on the 20th of March was the crowning moment of the Irrawaddy campaign, a symbolic victory that resonated through the entire theatre. The ancient Burmese capital had been under Japanese occupation since May 1942, its royal palace and pagodas shadowed by the Kempe headquarters that had administered a brutal rule. Now British and Indian soldiers marched through the deserted streets, their boots echoing on the pavements where Japanese patrols had walked for 2.5 years. The Burma campaign had turned full circle. The real prize, however, lay 70 miles to the south. Meiktila was the hub around which the entire Japanese logistical system revolved, a complex of warehouses, railway yards and airfields, through which passed every bullet and every bag of rice, destined for the Japanese divisions fighting on the Central Front. Slim had identified it as the key to destroying Japanese resistance in Burma, and he entrusted the assault to the 17th Indian Division under General Cowan, a formation that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of the Sittang Bridge disaster and that now burned for revenge. Cowan decided on a gamble that depended entirely on speed and surprise. His division would thrust 80 miles in 36 hours, a pace of advance that exceeded anything the Japanese believed possible, their tanks and lorries racing down narrow tracks through the scrubland east of the Irrawaddy. The advance guard consisted of the 255th Indian Tank Brigade, Shermans and Stuarts grinding through clouds of dust, infantry clinging to the hulls of the vehicles, the entire column stretching back for miles along a single track that wound through elephant grass and abandoned paddy fields. Japanese observation posts reported the movement, but their warnings were too slow and too late. On the 1st of March, the tanks of the lead squadron burst onto the Meiktila airstrip and caught its garrison completely by surprise. Japanese airfield troops scattered and died under the cannon and machine guns of the Shermans, fleeing through burning buildings and smashed aircraft, while the British infantry dismounted and fanned out through the perimeter. Within 2 hours the airstrip was secure, and the railway line leading north toward Mandalay and south toward Rangoon had been cut. Meiktila was now an island, its garrison trapped, and Cowan's division was pouring through the breach to consolidate its hold. The Japanese reaction was swift and savage. 3 divisions turned on the 17th from every direction, their commanders ordered by Sakurai to crush the bridgehead before it could be developed. Japanese infantry filtered through the jungle at night, creeping close to British positions, launching sudden attacks with grenades and bayonets that cut down sentries and overran forward posts. The defenders, following Slim's doctrine, pulled back into a tight perimeter that contracted around the airstrip and the shattered railway yards, their positions linked by trenches and wire that had been thrown up in a matter of hours. The siege of Meiktila had begun. For the next 3 weeks, the garrison withstood everything the Japanese could throw at them. Artillery observers called down fire from massed 25-pounders that smashed Japanese assembly areas and broke up the mass attacks before they could close to grenade range. Dakotas droned overhead every night, their bellies opening to drop ammunition crates and water containers onto the airstrip, while the Japanese responded with mortar fire that killed supply handlers and destroyed precious stores. Inside the perimeter, men fought and died over stretches of ground that changed hands 3 times in a single night, their uniforms stiff with dried blood, their faces grey with exhaustion. Ammunition and water were the currency of survival. The garrison's wells had been destroyed in the initial assault, and every liter of water had to be flown in by aircraft that braved Japanese anti-aircraft fire on their approach. Men on the perimeter held their positions for days without relief, their mouths parched, their ammunition running low, their reserves of strength draining away in the furnace heat of the central Burma plain. The medical orderlies worked in slit trenches lit by torches, amputating limbs and dressing wounds while mortar bombs crashed into the earth around them. It was the admin box on a vastly larger scale, and it demanded the same answer. The Japanese attacks grew more desperate as their own supplies dwindled, their regimental commanders throwing in their last reserves in assaults that were broken by artillery before they could close with the defenders. Airstrikes from RAF fighter bombers ranged unchallenged over the battlefield, their rockets and cannon fire tearing into Japanese columns that had no anti-aircraft defense and no air cover of their own. By the third week of March, the Japanese offensive was finished, its regiments reduced to a handful of starving men who crawled away through the jungle to die of wounds or disease. The 24th Indian Brigade broke through from the north on the 27th, and the siege was lifted. The Japanese central supply system collapsed in the wake of Maektilla's fall, its destruction dragging down every division that depended on the railway and road hub for its ammunition and rations. Sakurai's 28th Army, battered and starving, began to disintegrate as its soldiers abandoned their positions and fled south toward the Pegu-Yomas hills. The road to Rangoon lay open, and Slim issued orders for his corps to drive south with all possible speed before the monsoon broke and turned the tracks into impassable quagmires. On the 22nd of April, the forward elements of 4th Corps reached Pyobwe, the last major Japanese defensive line before Rangoon itself. The Japanese had thrown together a scratch force of rear-area troops, walking wounded and transport drivers armed with rifles, but their bunkers and pillboxes were built of bamboo and earth that could not withstand the concentrated fire of British armour and artillery. The 7th Armoured Brigade tore into the positions with a fury that spoke of 2 years of accumulated bitterness, their Shermans blasting bunkers at point-blank range while the infantry followed through with grenades and bayonets. Within 2 days the line was broken, and the retreat became a rout. The race for Rangoon was on, a headlong pursuit that drove Japanese rearguards before it like chaff before a storm. Forward patrols of 4th Corps reached Pegu on the 1st of May, just 45 miles from the ruined docks and the abandoned streets of the Burmese capital that had been lost in the dark days of March 1942. The sky was thick with the heavy monsoon clouds that would soon turn the roads to mud, but the war in Burma was won. The longest defeat in British military history had become the longest march to victory. Yet east of the Sittang River, the remnants of the Japanese 28th Army were trapped in the Pegu-Yomas hills, cut off from escape by the advancing British columns. The monsoon clouds that thickened over the plain would soon drown the tracks and turn the river into a roaring barrier. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, starved, sick, and leaderless, huddled in the bamboo thickets, waiting for a breakout that was already becoming impossible. These are not formed battalions, they are columns of skeletal men in rotting uniforms, their boots gone, their feet wrapped in strips of canvas or bare against the jungle floor. Thousands have died of starvation and malaria. Cholera tears through every bivouac. The monsoon rains lash the hillsides, turning shallow graves into seeping mud. Those who still move are driven by a single idea: to cross the Sittang and reach some fragment of Japanese-held territory on the far side. The British know they are coming. Ambush positions are laid along every track leading to the river. Tanks and infantry block the obvious crossing points. Fighter bombers range over the Pegu-Yomas at will, their cannons and rockets tearing into bamboo thickets where Japanese soldiers huddle. The slaughter is methodical and pitiless. Men die clutching photographs of families they will never see again. Others drown attempting to swim the Sittang in spate, their emaciated bodies dragged under by the monsoon current. Only a fraction make the far bank. They emerge from the brown water trembling and weeping, their numbers counted in dozens where once there were regiments. The breakout from the Pegu-Yomas is not a military operation. It is a death march, the final convulsion of an army that had conquered an empire and now cannot save itself. The organized resistance of the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma is finished. Across the country, isolated garrisons wait in bunkers and hilltop positions. Their radios have fallen silent, their ammunition is spent, They eat roots and leaves, trade rifle bolts for handfuls of rice in villages that no longer fear them. They do not know that in August, atomic bombs will fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They do not know that the emperor will speak on the radio, his voice heard by his subjects for the first time, telling them to endure the unendurable. The news of surrender reaches Burma in fragments. Japanese officers gather their remaining men and read the imperial rescript aloud. Some weep, some burn regimental colors, some commit suicide with their swords, kneeling in the mud facing Tokyo. Most simply sit in silence, the weight of 4 years of war settling upon them like a physical thing. On the 28th of August, a launch carries a party of Japanese officers across Rangoon Harbour toward the grey bulk of HMS Sussex. Lieutenant General Numata Takazo, Chief of Staff of Southern Army, steps onto the quarterdeck. He wears a plain khaki uniform stripped of decorations. His face is drawn and rigid. The British officers are waiting, their white uniforms crisp in the humid air. The surrender document is placed on a table draped with a Union Jack. It is a formal instrument, its paragraphs typed carefully on heavy paper. Numata bends over it, reads for a long moment, then takes the offered pen. His hand does not shake. The signature he leaves is clean and deliberate. A photographer records the moment. A staff officer blots the ink. Japan has surrendered in Burma. Across the country, the ritual repeats itself a dozen times. The British accept the formal capitulation of every surviving Japanese unit. In one dusty clearing, the commander of the 31st Division, the same division that had stormed up the terraces of Kohima and fought hand-to-hand on the tennis court, presents his sword to Major General Crowther. The blade is a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Crowther accepts it without ceremony, and an interpreter quietly explains what will happen next. General Slim does not attend the Rangoon ceremony. He has already been promoted to command Allied land forces Southeast Asia, overseeing the occupation of Malaya and the vast task of disarming scattered Japanese armies across half a continent. The man who had watched his shattered soldiers limp out of Burma in 1942 now presides over the final extinction of the empire that had humiliated them. His war is ending, but a different kind of work is beginning. The country that the British and Japanese had fought over for 4 years is not the country either of them had expected to find. Burma has been transformed by occupation and war. Its politics are fractured, its economy is smashed, its people are hungry and suspicious of old masters and former liberators alike. The white man's burden and the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere have both collapsed into the same monsoon mud. The men who survived the longest campaign of the Second World War carried their memories home and kept them close. For decades afterward, veterans of the 14th Army would meet in quiet clubs and remember the furnace heat of the Central Plain, the scream of shells over the admin box, and the face of a young Gurkha holding a trench on the Kohima tennis court. They would also remember the column commanders Michael Calvert and Bernard Ferguson, who lived to write the story of that first long-range penetration behind enemy lines. And they would remember Ord Wingate, the gaunt, fierce visionary who had conceived the Chindit raids, killed in an air crash in March 1944, never to see the final victory his ideas had helped to shape. And they would remember the sappers who blew the Sittang Bridge, Bashir Ahmed Khan and Roy Hudson, who continued to serve through the war and carried the memory of that desperate morning for the rest of their lives. They would recall the words carved into the stone of the war cemetery in the Naga Hills. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today. Those days were not wasted. They bought something real, even if it was not the empire they had marched to defend. They bought the chance for others to choose their own tomorrows, in Burma and beyond.